Good afternoon. I'm Marcia Harris. I'm a board member and program chair of Voice for Israel. And on behalf of Voice for Israel, I want to welcome you to today's program on Israel and Jewish studies on college campuses. Our program today is being sponsored by Voice for Israel and co-sponsored by Stand With Us. For those of you that might not be familiar with Voice for Israel, we are an all-volunteer, nonpartisan organization based in the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area, and our mission is Israel education and advocacy. Today, we've gathered a prestigious panel to talk to you about a topic that may be somewhat surprising and probably somewhat disturbing to you once you hear this. Most of us are, as Jewish parents and grandparents and adults in the community, are very pleased when we hear that a campus is offering a department of Jewish studies or Israel studies. And often we're encouraging our students, our kids, our grandkids to take courses in these departments. I think we assume that the departments are pro-Israel or at the very least neutral on Israel. Sadly, some of the departments of Jewish studies, as well as certainly departments of Middle Eastern studies on campus, are anti-Zionists, and they're using their platforms in the classroom to turn students away from Israel. Our panelists today will be discussing this topic. I now want to turn the program over to Dr. Mike Ross. Dr. Ross is a co-founder and president of Voice for Israel, and he will be moderating and introducing the panel. Before Mike begins, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions, and we will address them at the end of the program. Thank you very much. Mike?
Thank you, Marcia. I'm very excited about today's program, and I want to introduce the topic to you about the climate on campus today. Most of our audience, not academicians, but you are all stakeholders in what happens on campus as alumni, as students or parents, and as people who care deeply about Israel and the future of America. To set the stage, I will start by touching on the existing environment on campus and how this impacts the departments of Jewish and Israel studies. Sapir, a journal of Jewish conversations, recently held an interview titled The Misuse of Expertise with Professor Jonathan Sarna, a past president of the Association of Jewish Studies. The following excerpts are from Sapir's introduction to that interview and provide insights on the current environment in the academy. Scholars possess a unique kind of power. They are the experts on whom we rely to educate our children and our communities and to elevate our understanding of past and present. The power of the expert has long derived from the assumption that they bring objective and incisive analysis to the topics at hand. But the standard of academic objectivity has long been eroding. Thanks to the postmodernist rejection of Enlightenment ideals such as truth and objectivity, many scholars have come to instead embrace subjectivity, the influence of identity in understanding the world, and theories that argue that the motivating forces behind civilization are struggles for power along the lines of gender, race, class, sexuality, and so forth. Once scholars began to see the past and present through the lens of power, a binary between the oppressors who have power and the oppressed who do not, it was a short step to arguing that scholarship and teaching should not simply open students' minds to injustice and oppression, but should be used as tools to combat it. Hence the rise of the so-called scholar activist. Now, as an aside, many of us may have sympathy with some or many of the viewpoints of these scholar activists, but it is this redefinition of the role of the academician that should concern us. Jewish studies have not been immune from such trends. In the last several years, the Jewish Studies Activist Network has weighed in on many contemporary political conflicts in the US and Israel. Calls to action proliferate across the field. Most recently, over 200 Jewish and Israel studies scholars signed a May 2021 statement labeling Zionism as, quote, a diverse set of linked ethno-nationalist ideologies shaped by settler colonial paradigms that have contributed to unjust, enduring, and unsustainable systems of Jewish supremacy, ethno-national segregation, discrimination, and violence against Palestinians. Something seems terribly amiss in Jewish and Israel studies departments. This statement has set off alarm bells of immense concern for many of us and actually helped precipitate today's event. We are blessed today with a very distinguished panel who are well equipped with both scholarly expertise and personal experience to address these issues and to provide guidance in the face of this critical challenge. Each panelist will speak for maybe 8 to 10 minutes, and then we will have a 15-minute panel discussion followed by opening it up for audience Q&A. And as Marcia said, please submit your questions in the Q&A box. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Miriam Ellman is Executive Director of the Academic Engagement Network and an Associate Professor of Political Science at Syracuse. She's an award-winning scholar and teacher. She has written prolifically about contemporary anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel movement on college campuses, and academic freedom. Oren Gross is a professor of law at the University of Minnesota. He is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of international law and national security law. He is the author of numerous articles and 2 award-winning books. Between 1986 and 1991, he served as a senior legal advisory officer in the international law branch of the IDF Judge Advocate General's Corps. Jared Taney is Associate Professor of History and a distinguished scholar in Jewish history at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He has published numerous op-eds on anti-Semitism in multiple Jewish publications. He is currently working on a larger study on Jewish humor and post-World War II America. So, without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Miriam Ellman. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you, Marcia, and thanks to Voice for Israel and to the audience for joining. I presented for Voice for Israel, I think 2 years ago before COVID in person, and I hope to have that opportunity again to join you in person not too long from now. It's also a great pleasure to be on this panel with 2 longtime colleagues, Oren and Jared. Let me start with the usual caveat, namely that I am speaking today on my own behalf and not for Syracuse University. We've been asked to speak about the state of play on our issues in the disciplines of Jewish and Israel studies. And it may be helpful to begin by way of comparison, to compare these disciplines to, say, gender and women's studies and ethnic studies in the academy. The comparison is apt because, like Jewish studies, those fields of study are also housed in the humanities and soft social sciences, and they're also interdisciplinary programs with faculty lines and tenure homes elsewhere. So this May, as Hamas was hurling 4,000 missiles onto Israeli civilians, and as American Jews were being targeted in their communities, in their schools, and in the streets, hundreds of gender studies and ethnic studies departments saw fit not to condemn Hamas or the attacks on Jews in the diaspora, but to denounce Israel. The statements they issued were highly inflammatory in tone. They were factually inaccurate. One issued by Yale's program in ethnicity, race, and migration, for example, absolved the Palestinians of any agency for the violence while accusing Israel of creating, quote, an infrastructure of cruelty and domination. Statements issued by nearly 200 gender studies departments didn't mention Hamas at all, not even once. Unbelievably, those hundreds of departments refused to call the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a conflict. And they also pledged to advance only the BDS perspective in their department pedagogy and curriculum. It's really hard to overstate the unprecedented threat to the guiding principles of the academy that these departmental statements represent, or the negative impact that they're already having on the campus climate for Jewish students. Essentially, what we have here is entire departments baking anti-Zionism into their mission statements. Jewish Zionist students, not to mention any dissenting faculty, are now thoroughly alienated from these academic spaces and degree programs. Now, judged along those lines, Jewish studies and Israel studies is doing better, although admittedly, it's a pretty low bar. To the best of my knowledge, no US-based Jewish studies or Israel studies department or program issued any such inflammatory statement last spring. What we saw instead was some 250 self-identified scholars of Jewish and Israel studies signing, as individual scholars, a statement released on May 22nd, and Mike just mentioned it. It was released just a day after the military operation ended, and it harshly condemned Israel's actions and policies in East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the West Bank. Now, the statement did mention, quote, unjustifiable and indiscriminate Hamas rockets. And it did recognize that Israel is, quote, a site of substantial Jewish diversity and cultural flourishing. Let's not forget that 500 religious studies faculty and graduate students signed a statement that actually quoted the sage Hillel in one sentence and then proceeded to accuse Israel of, quote, genocide in the next. So at least these Jewish and Israel studies scholars didn't do that. In fact, there were statements signed by scholars in other disciplines that were far, far worse. Still, we should consider that prominent Jewish and Israel studies scholars were devoting hours to writing up vehemently anti-Israel petitions at exactly the same time that American Jewish diners were being assaulted in Los Angeles restaurant by individuals carrying Palestinian flags, when a Jewish man in Manhattan wearing a Jewish Star of David was being punched, and another in Las Vegas was assaulted by a stranger who said Jews are baby killers. In May 2021, when they were drafting this statement, over 400 rallies across the country featured attempts to foment anti-Zionism. The ADL documented cases where classical anti-Semitism was expressed at these anti-Israel protests, and they were often held in the immediate vicinity of Jewish day schools and synagogues. So these Jewish and Israel studies academics saw fit not to write a statement to condemn that, namely holding all Jews responsible for Israeli actions, but instead to spend their time writing and thinking about signing a document that castigates Zionism, Israel's founding, and its governance, and that references the ugly slur Jewish supremacy. The goal of the statement on Israel-Palestine by these scholars of Jewish and Israel studies is essentially to create a safe space for anti-Zionism and BDS scholarship within these disciplines. Never mind that a safe space already exists in Palestine studies, where the settler colonial paradigm dominates in hundreds of courses, in scores of peer-reviewed articles and books published by academic presses. They call for a place for Palestine and Jewish studies, but there is no place for Israel in Palestine studies. In this sense, the statement signed by these 250 scholars is an add-on to the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, and there's a considerable overlap in the signatory lists. With the Jerusalem Declaration, too, hundreds of US-based academics, among them many Jewish and Israel studies scholars, signed a document that tries to carve out a tolerable form of anti-Zionism, one that can accommodate BDS. I've written elsewhere that BDS is a threat to academic freedom and campus free expression, and I don't think I need to tell this audience that it demonizes and delegitimizes Jewish self-determination and seeks an end to Israel as the sovereign homeland of the Jewish people. On campus, BDS does contribute to a climate of hostility towards Jews, especially self-identified Zionist Jews, but all Jews are ultimately impacted negatively. BDS marginalizes Jews on campus. It's really that simple. It's fair to conclude that many Jewish studies and Israel studies faculty just aren't helping to address any of this. With some notable exceptions, which I'll mention in a minute, they aren't helping to improve the campus climate. They aren't helping Jewish students who are increasingly reporting that they feel like they have to hide huge chunks of their Jewish identity in order to get by and in order to fit in. Jewish studies faculty are by and large silent in the face of spiking campus anti-Semitism. Very few of them support the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, last year, over 400 faculty signed a statement in support of the IHRA. It was spearheaded by the International Legal Forum, and it's really an excellent document that points to how this widely accepted standard is a helpful tool for educating about contemporary anti-Semitism. In general, I'm not a huge fan of petitions in lieu of scholarship, but I was happy to sign this one. And Oren and Jared, I know, signed it too. Jewish students need to know that there are faculty out there who support their basic humanity and their right to express their identities free of harassment, exclusion, and ostracism. And that's what the statement says. But very few Jewish and Israel studies faculty signed it, and only a handful of senior scholars, directors of Israel studies, or directors of Jewish studies programs, with only a few notable exceptions. The US-based signatories, including prominent academics, are in other disciplines, particularly in the STEM fields. And the impact of Zionist faculty in STEM fields, by the way, is growing, and it's very welcome. And I can give some examples in the Q&A. The problem really is what gets rewarded in these fields. And notice how many junior faculty in Jewish studies, not yet tenured assistant professors, PhD candidates, signed the statement on Israel-Palestine. It's a very rational choice for them to sign. In fact, given the number of full professors, named chairs in Jewish studies who are anti-Zionist and ardent proponents of BDS, not signing these documents carries the greater professional risk. These days, one has to denounce Israel and renounce Zionism to be an accepted member of the progressive left. And interdisciplinary programs like Jewish studies and Israel studies in the humanities are top heavy with progressive faculty in senior positions. So that pretty much accounts for the deafening silence in Jewish studies, at least among the junior faculty. We should acknowledge something else too, the way it impacts the campus climate, precisely because these Jewish studies faculty are the go-to people for administrators when anti-Semitic incidents happen on campus. I'm not speaking here about the swastikas that might be etched on a bathroom stall or on the side of a dormitory or on my campus this past winter dug into the snow. Typically, administrators don't need help with that. They do pretty well. They're usually swift and unequivocal denunciations, but they don't really do well with anti-Semitism on the left. It's on the inside, it's being normalized, it's being mainstreamed on campuses. University officials need help understanding it, and they naturally turn to senior scholars, named chairs or directors in Jewish studies or in Israel studies for help. And if that person is a BDS proponent, you can bet the incident is going to be minimized. Or worse, it's going to be determined that right-wingers are trying to weaponize anti-Semitism to silence legitimate criticism of Israel. We hear that all the time. It's often Jewish faculty who are making this, quote, weaponizing anti-Semitism charge. And they invariably preface the allegation by reminding university officials that, quote, as a Jew, they know best. The fields of Jewish studies and Israel studies are experiencing generational changes. In Israel studies, many of the leading scholars like Ilan Troen and Donna Devine have retired. They brought nuance to the study of Israel's history and current realities. They offered rational discussions based on evidence. This book, Essential Israel, co-edited by Ilan Troen and Rachel Fish, is a great example of that. Will more books like this be published? I'm not sure. The people who published in those books, like Troen and Devine, spoke the languages. They were immersed in the archives. They were also Zionists. But a new crop of scholars in Jewish studies are happy to join the anti-Israel bandwagon. They're okay with Zionism being excised from Judaism. So I've pointed to some worrying trends in the field of Jewish and Israel studies, and my fellow panelists will flag others. But before I turn the floor over to my colleagues, let me just close with the word of optimism. The sky is not falling. We have not lost Jewish studies or Israel studies. There are concerted efforts to push anti-Israel narratives in these fields, but there's also pushback. In my organization, AAN, there are several dozen Jewish and Israel studies faculty members who are working to counter BDS inroads. We should note a lot of good work that's being done at Brooklyn College in CUNY System, the chair of Jewish studies, and is a proud and open Zionist, helping Jewish students there. At Michigan State, the Jewish Studies Department issued a terrific statement decrying the spate of anti-Semitic incidents on the campus and calling for the entire campus community to support it. And many departments have now joined them. At Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, faculty in Judaic and Hebrew studies joined colleagues in other disciplines in STEM and business to condemn the one-sided and biased faculty statement issued in solidarity with Palestine. They criticized their colleagues for their poor speech, insisting that they reconsider how their incendiary communications demonizing Israel have negatively impacted Jewish students. And those are just a few examples of Jewish studies faculty. They are tenured, and that might be part of it, but they are not afraid to stand up and speak out. That should give us hope and some reason for optimism. For the most part, though, and on many campuses, students who identify as Zionists and just want to be treated with the same respect afforded to other minority groups are going to have to look beyond faculty in Jewish and Israel studies for mentoring, help, and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. That was terrific. So let me now hand it over to Professor Oren Gross. If you can, great. Thanks.
All right. So thank you, Voice for Israel. Thank you, Stand With Us, and Marsha and Mike. I want to thank my co-panelists, and even more so the audience who are spending precious Sunday afternoon hours being here. Couple of things before I actually kind of launch in. Miriam started by a disclaimer saying that she speaks not on behalf of AN, but basically in her personal capacity. I will say the same, and actually frequently I'm not even speaking on my own behalf. So, whatever that is. The question that we have is there a problem with Israel and Jewish studies? I can basically stop my talk and say yes, unless of course we set the bar so low, such as, and Miriam hinted to that, such as, Jewish studies professors are not teaching genocide. Okay, or at least not genocide done by Israel. If we set the bar that low, then maybe there isn't a problem. Other than that, I think there is a serious problem. And yes, maybe the sky has not fallen yet, but I would say that it is manifestly lower. We might be able to actually touch the ceiling. And the last thing that I just want to say by way of just a general introduction, we've heard several times already this notion of tenure. That people without tenure are afraid to speak. And yes, it's easy for me. I'm a chaired professor. It's easy for me to speak. But I would actually say that the tenure issue is actually a canard, because if you look at the statement that Miriam mentioned, signed by scholars of Jewish and Israel studies, actually quite a number of them were untenured professors. So being untenured is not scary to you. If you are demonizing Israel, it might be so if you are pro-Israel. And that tells you something about the problem that we have on campus today. So let me try and kind of briefly summarize some of my thoughts and writings on the matter. And I want to kind of start by directing everybody's attention to two phenomena that frequently we don't think about them as connected, but I would argue are very strongly connected. The first is what has been called the war on reason, or the war on knowledge, or in scholarship. We see this on campus, the war on free speech. Reason loses out time and again to the right, or the so-called right, not to be offended. And professors are moving from teaching to think critically to brainwashing their students with the flavor of the day. And the examples here are too numerous, but I think we all know what I'm talking about here. A second phenomenon that, as I said, frequently seen as unrelated, is the rise of anti-Semitism acts and speech. In fact, if you look at the United States, religious-based hate crimes in the United States are overwhelmingly anti-Jewish. What do I mean by overwhelmingly? If you take the last 10, 15 years, then anti-Jewish crimes constitute over 60% on average of all religious-based hate crimes in the United States. That means, and by the way, the situation is significantly worse in Europe. That means that anti-Jewish hate crimes constitute more than hate crimes against all other religious groups combined. Now, the two phenomena, as I said, to me, are not distinct and separate, but rather closely linked and intertwined. And I actually draw much support here from a short essay or a short book that was written towards the end of World War II, right after Paris was liberated, by Jean-Paul Sartre. Nobody can suspect him of being a right-winger, who identifies anti-Semitism as a deep-seated passion that extends, in his words, to the physiological realm, as happens in cases of hysteria. It is, he argues, a rejection, a passionate rejection of reason and rationalism. So, not surprisingly, where rational discourse, where evidence-based reasoning wanes, anti-Semitism, among other things, flourishes. And in fact, I would argue that Jews often are the canaries, if you will, in the mine for things such as the loss of freedom, the loss of democracy, the loss of liberalism, the loss of reason. And indeed, there is, I would say, a strong correlation between societies that are less democratic, where liberalism is not in its prime, where reasoned discourse and rational conversation are not strong, and the weakening of Jewish life and Jewish communal life. More than that, the convergence of the flight from reason and into the cold embrace of anti-Semitism is facilitated, as I've argued elsewhere, by at least four groups, or at least four main groups: the ill-intentioned, the ill-informed, the useful idiots, and the moral and intellectual spineless cowards. I'm not going to talk about the first two. I'm going to focus on the role of Jews and scholars of Jewish and Israel studies in the last two, the useful idiots and the moral and intellectual spineless cowards. Now, here I would suggest that we need to separate between two versions of anti-Semitism, as Dara Horn mentions it in her recent book, People Love Dead Jews. Right? There's the Purim version, which we all know. This is the swastika, this is the kill the Jews. This is the one that is easy to spot, the easy kind of to act against. Then there's the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism, where the ultimate goal is to eliminate Jewish civilization and eliminate Jewish tradition, but to do so while leaving, as Horn says, the warm, de-Jewed bodies of former practitioners intact. And it is to this type of anti-Semitism that Jewish participation has been essential, right, throughout Jewish history. It is Jews who desperately want to fit in and who, in the process, would be ready and willing to throw under the proverbial bus the Jewish people, Jewish values, Jewish tradition, the Jewish state, Jewish pride, in order to be accepted to the cool kids club or the country club of the day, be it communism, be it German nationalism, and I'm talking here about German nationalism before and during World War I, obviously not German nationalism of World War II. These have always served, those type of Jews have always served as agents for this type of anti-Semitism, right? And they've actually been essential for this type of anti-Semitism. They've been essential because they confer legitimacy and respectability. They've been essential because they serve as some sort of an immunity charm against the charge of anti-Semitism. And indeed, if you think about it, anyone who speaks as a Jew surely cannot be an anti-Semite. And the same, again, surely applies to the causes that are supported and promoted by those converts to the cause. Those Jews, therefore, serve as the detergent agents laundering anti-Semitic campaigns. And in fact, I would argue, no stronger case for such Jews exists than the many, but not all, scholars of Israel and Jewish studies who rush to Jewash those self-styled progressives. And in fact, part of the problem is that such pathetic action is then met with cowardly silence on the part of the vast majority of the other scholars of Israel and Jewish studies. And I'm saying here, by the way, no stronger case, because when we speak of conferring legitimacy and respectability, and while we are talking about awarding immunity against charges of anti-Semitism, the contribution that is made by distinguished professors who profess expertise in the field and better yet, many of whom are Jewish, is virtually priceless. And Mike already mentioned in his introduction this notion of the power of self-styled experts. Although I would say, as Menachem Kellner said, that we see frequently many experts in Jewish studies who do not know Jewish languages, Hebrew, Yiddish, Ladino, and scholars of Israel studies who cannot actually read the daily Israeli newspapers. What we see in Jewish studies and Israel studies is a growing trend of those studies becoming echo chambers of, at best, silence, where unapologetic Zionists, such as myself, feel increasingly isolated. And I would argue that in the process, those professors, those academics are betraying their own academic mission. Forget the flight from Jewish history and tradition. Consider the flight from evidence, from reason, from rational discourse. How can a self-styled scholar of Jewish, forget Israel, Jewish studies, could sign a statement that speaks of the fact that the Zionist movement is shaped by settler colonial paradigm, forgetting 4,000 years of Jewish attachment to the land, forgetting Jewish prayer books? How can a scholar of Jewish and Israel studies, right, say that most of the land now in Israel was once owned by Palestinian population that the state displaced? How can a scholar say that Israel prevented the return of Palestinians during and after the 1948 war? And by the way, God forbid we call it the War of Independence. In the same statement, quite telling, if you read the statement really carefully, the statement signed by scholars of Israel and Jewish studies, there's another language that is frequently ignored. Those signing the statement say, and I quote, "We share and hold the pain of Gazans." 3 lines later, they say, "We affirm the pain, fear, and anger of Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel." So we share the pain of Palestinians in Gaza. We affirm the pain of Israelis. Right? How deluded, how self-deluded must you be to write such a thing? Let's ignore, not that we can, the fact that many of those scholars of Israel studies are not content to challenge specific policies of this Israeli government or that Israeli government, but are challenging the very right of the Jewish state to exist. Let's ignore the fact that scholars of Jewish studies are peddling the idea that Jews and Jews alone are not entitled to self-determination as a people. But you also have those scholars of Jewish studies who would not call out anti-Semitism when it looks them straight in the face. And on the rare occasion that they do call it, they make sure to bundle it up tightly with other forms of hate, even if those have nothing to do with a particular incidents. So if Jews are attacked in Los Angeles, frequently you would hear calls to reject anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. What's Islamophobia got to do with that? I don't know. Scholars of Jewish studies also deny and denounce, as I said, thousands of years of Jewish particularism in favor of some idealized, pie-in-the-sky set of universal values. So, and this is especially ironic because while the left today celebrates a multiplicity of groups that are asserting their own identities, they reject the possibility of Jews, right, asserting their own Jewish identities. But the Jews that are doing so, I would argue, are also ignoring the lessons of Jewish history and the universalist repeated betrayal of Jews. I will stop here. I will just mention for those interested, and some of you may know this, that over the summer, I actually resigned my affiliation with the Center for Jewish Studies and my university, the University of Minnesota, where I think I was the only lawyer affiliated with the center. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Let me stop here.
Thank you. That was a very stirring presentation. And I think our audience, I'm sure, appreciated the clear delineations of concern. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jared. If you can turn on your video and audio. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Am I audible? I'll take that as a guess. Mike, can you hear me?
Yes, you are.
Okay,
You are
thanks.
perfectly audible.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak here on this panel. I'm very honored and thrilled to be among the likes of Professor Ellman and Professor Gross, whose work has certainly inspired me. And I'd also ask you to bear with me because I am getting over a nasty cold and strep throat, so my voice might give out at some point a little bit. And I will also echo what Miriam said at the beginning. I am not speaking here on behalf of anyone except for myself. Okay, so August 2017, Charlottesville. What happened? An outpouring of anger and grief from Jewish Studies faculty. October 2018, the Tree of Life massacre. What happened? An outpouring of anger and grief from Jewish Studies faculty. May 2021, threats and violence in the diaspora against Jews because of what Israel was allegedly doing. The response? A collective letter from 400 self-professed Jewish studies experts blaming Israel entirely for all that had happened. Now, when this happened, I wrote an op-ed titled, "Jewish Studies, You Have Failed." I stand by this statement today. And I would like to elaborate on this failure, in part because it's not exactly for the reason stated in the flyer for today's event. So the flyer states, and I quote, "Many Israel Jewish studies departments are advancing anti-Israel narratives that indoctrinate students against Israel." This isn't precisely correct. Why? What do I mean by that? Well, because aside from a handful of very notorious exceptions and very vocal exceptions in Jewish studies, the anti-Zionist indoctrination is coming from outside of Jewish studies. This is what, in terms of talking about what's going on in the classroom. It is coming from faculty in ethnic studies, Middle Eastern studies, disability studies, women and gender studies, communications, and other such programs. These are programs that have all become popular and trendy in recent years because of their avowed drive to bring social justice into the classroom at the expense of critical inquiry. No, Jewish studies has failed because they have not pushed back against this perversion of education. And whenever events heat up and erupt into a conflict in the wider media and academics feel it necessary to speak out publicly, Jewish studies always sides with the anti-Zionists, much as they did in May 2021 when they issued a statement unilaterally condemning Israel, ignoring Hamas terrorism, and offering nothing but a rather anodyne rejection of, and I quote, "all expressions of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia." Just as Professor Gross had pointed out, when you insist on denouncing Islamophobia in the very same breath that you condemn anti-Semitism, at the very moment when Hamas apologists are literally attacking Jews in the streets of America, yet nobody was attacking Palestinians, then you are in fact saying all lives matter to the Jews. You're siding with the anti-Semite. So why is Jewish studies doing this? Why are they publicly siding with the anti-Semites in academia, even if it is not, for the most part, reflective of what they're teaching in their classrooms? Before I answer this, let me just list some of these anti-Zionist tropes being propagated in the classroom so you can better understand how this is, in fact, anti-Semitism being disguised as scholarship. Palestine is a queer issue. Palestine is a disability issue. Palestine is a climate justice issue. From Standing Rock to Palestine, our lands are not for sale. These are just a few of the tropes that are popular among scholar activists who are working against Israel. Each one of them links peoples, territories, and phenomena that have absolutely nothing to do with each other. For this reason, they should be rejected entirely, yet they are not. Intersectionality, as interpreted on campus today, irrespective of the term's original meaning, and I want to be clear about that, intersectionality claims that all oppressions are linked. Unless everyone is free, nobody is free. You can't be against one oppression without being against them all. For this to have relevance to Israel-Palestine, Israel and its supporters must be centered as the universal oppressors. Scholar activists in gender studies, queer studies, disability studies, and ethnic studies have achieved this through ideologically driven frameworks that really do not hold up under scrutiny. But among the left today, facts do not matter. Feelings are what count. For the Nazis, it was not enough that the Jews were an evil ethno-national community. The Jews had to be global, conspiratorial, and the beneficiaries of an apocalyptic transnational war. Similarly, for anti-Zionists, Israel and its supporters must be global, conspiratorial, and the beneficiaries of the so-called, quote, colonial systems of oppression against which social justice scholar activists fight. For instance, they argue that Zionism is an assault against indigenous peoples, a form of white racism against people of color, and an instance of European imperialism. According to this logic, Israel was constructed through the same historical processes that led to the colonization of the Americas, the genocide of Native Americans, and the enslavement of Africans. Palestinians are, quote, indigenous people of color, and their liberation is connected directly to justice for Native Americans, Black Americans, and anyone else who is not white. Palestine is a queer issue, and Israel is guilty of perpetuating homophobia. According to this logic, Israel is practicing what's been called pinkwashing, using its so-called gay liberation practices as cover to oppress Palestinians. At the extreme end, it has even been argued that gay Palestinians suffer for being gay because of Israeli occupation, not because Hamas and the Palestinian Authority persecute gay people with alacrity and severity. Palestine is a disability issue. This is my favorite one. This is as creative as it gets. Israel deliberately maims Palestinians, shoots them so they are physically disabled, tampers with their food supply so their growth is stunted, withholds medication, experiments on Palestinian bodies, and harvests their organs. Now, if the latter reminds you of the medieval blood libel, well, you see where this is going. These are just a few of the claims that come together to signify that what they consider to be Zionism is anti-native, imperialist, white supremacist, Islamophobic, homophobic, and ableist. Intersectionalist social justice cannot be achieved at the global level until those guilty of preventing it, that is to say, Israel and the Jews who support it, are quashed. Now, lest there be any doubt, this is anti-Semitism. Jews are being held to a double standard through carefully worded academic discourse. Jews are the only ethno-national minority being accused of these practices on college campuses in the United States and Europe, both inside and outside the classroom. Now, to be sure, academics have every right to engage in activism. What I'm doing right now is a form of activism. But should they be allowed to bring this into the classroom? How is it okay to place ideology before critical inquiry, nuance, and debate? And lest there be any doubt, they are bringing this into the classroom. I will quote from one of the many statements issued over the past year, this one from a group called Scholars for Palestinian Freedom. In it, they write, "It is no longer acceptable to conduct research in Palestine or on Palestinians without a clear component of political commitment. In the classroom," they actually say this, "in the classroom and on campus, we commit to pressuring our academic institutions and organizations to respect the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. We commit to supporting student activism on campus. We commit to extending the above approach to any and all indigenous scholars within the university." What it has to do with them, I do not know. "And any indigenous communities within the vicinity. We commit to centering indigenous analyses in teaching and drawing links to intersectional oppression and transnational liberation movements." Now, if Palestine is centered in this manner as the universal victim of colonial oppression, well, then Israel is by definition demonized as the universal oppressor. If teachers indoctrinate their students to view Israeli imperialism as global, then any American Jew who affiliates with their ancestral ethno-national homeland, and we have the right to associate with our ethno-national homeland, is complicit in thwarting social justice, not only over there, but everywhere. Students will walk out of such classes distrusting their Jewish neighbors. Palestinian activists will hold American Jews responsible for what they call Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. And this is precisely what happened last May, when fighting broke out between Israel and Hamas, and several dozen, actually perhaps 100, academic departments, disciplines, and associations issued statements placing all blame entirely with Israel. This is precisely what happens regularly on numerous campuses, because groups like Students for Justice in Palestine propagate these views with the encouragement of their faculty advisors. So, where is Jewish studies in all this? Now, there are plenty of activists within the field of Jewish studies. Following the election of Trump, the so-called Jewish Studies Activist Network, which I was briefly a member of, and various other groups issued statements. They issued statements and then statement after statement condemning Islamophobia, police brutality, and various other causes. Clearly, they aren't afraid to speak out. Did they ever condemn anti-Semitism? Yes, but only if the anti-Semitism came from white supremacists. Did they ever bring up Israel? Yes, but only to condemn actions of the American and Israeli government, such as the relocation of the American embassy to Jerusalem or Trump's executive order condemning anti-Semitism. No, Jewish studies will not condemn anti-Semitism that emanates from the left, and they will certainly not speak out against their colleagues in other disciplines who use their classrooms to propagate anti-Semitism. Why? Simply put, the ticket of admission to social justice circles, and social justice is the party line in academia today, is to all lives matter the Jews. To reduce anti-Semitism to a right-wing phenomenon bound up with all forms of racism, and to deny that it even exists on the left in any meaningful way. And it entails condemning Israel. Anti-Zionism is a non-negotiable prerequisite for being woke. And for many in Jewish studies today, being accepted by their anti-Zionist colleagues is far more important than standing up to left anti-Semitism. So, in May 2021, over 400 Jewish studies scholars signed a petition condemning Israel with little thought to how it might impact Jewish students, the wider Jewish community, or their donors who have raised money so that Jewish studies professors can conduct fruitful communal engagement, both with Jews and with non-Jews. So to return to my starting point, I don't think most of these 400 professors are disseminating anti-Zionist propaganda in their classrooms. There is a very small but admittedly powerful minority in Jewish studies that does this, but they are a small minority. So I think the claim that Jewish students have to worry about taking classes with most of these Jewish studies professors is largely alarmist and unsubstantiated. Nevertheless, and this is the key point, Jewish studies is deeply complicit. Why? Because they have signed off on the anti-Zionism and left-wing anti-Semitism being propagated in virtually every other corner of academia, except for perhaps STEM. And if the accepted experts in Jewish history, politics, and culture won't stand up against the demonization of the Jews, well, then I ask you guys, who exactly will? I will stop here. Thank you.
Wow, that was terrific. All of you, thank you. We are heading close to the hour. I had prepared some thoughts to put before you, but I think in the interests of time and to allow our audience to participate, I will let Marcia come in and lead the Q&A. Although, let me just lead. I can't help myself. I did want to ask Miriam. You were so modest to not talk about what AEN offers and what you do, and let me enlarge it to both Oren and Jared as well. What can be done about this phenomenon? What do you think will be done, and what would you say is the future? What's going to evolve in the next 5 to 10 years on this? So Miriam, why don't you take it, start with what AEN does?
Sure. Well, first of all, Oren and Jared are longtime members of the Academic Engagement Network, and we have a little over 800 members on 250 campuses now across the country. And they all basically agree with me, Oren, and Jared. That's our position. We aren't going to stand for this. We're very concerned about the health of the academy. I think all three of us mentioned that this isn't just about Jewish or Israel studies, these two disciplines. This is about the health of the academy as a whole and reclaiming the academy for fact-based production of knowledge. So we can get a lot of allies, and that's part of what AEN does. We look for allies who don't know anything about Israel, who don't know anything about Jewish experience or Jewish identity, and don't work in those fields, but do know a lot about the production of knowledge and what the university mission is supposed to be, and how we can create a tolerant and inclusive learning environment while also championing the guiding principles of the AAUP, academic freedom and campus free expression, because they're not on opposite sides. So we talked a lot about STEM, a few of us already, and I think if you look at one of the best faculty statements written last year in support of Zionism and Zionist students and critiquing the anti-Zionism that is seeping into the academy was written by two STEM faculty, Judea Pearl at UCLA and Anna Krylov at University of Southern California. They managed to get 60 faculty at USC to sign. Not a single Jewish or Israel Studies faculty member signed that document. I just looked at it. And therein lies the problem. But there are a lot of faculty who will support what we're trying to do, and some Jewish and Israel Studies faculty among them.
I'll add something to that. And I think I articulated this on Facebook last night. The time has come where Jewish studies, professors and our flagship organizations need to step up. They need to, because our flagship organizations aren't, anti-Israel. Obviously not. They do have panels at their annual conferences. They do have people who give nuanced presentations in terms of their scholarship. But even though the ideal should be that these academic associations should not be engaged in activism, when every other academic association outside of Jewish studies in every department is issuing statement after statement condemning what is an intrinsic part of Jewish identity at this point, then it's time for Jewish studies organizations to actually say something. They need to raise their collective voice, and they can't let this one vocal minority group within Jewish studies bully everyone else into following the party line. Now, it's the only way, if there's any hope, to combat the wider trend in academia that has clearly turned on not only Israel, but it's having ramifications against Jewish students on campuses. If the Jewish studies professors won't collectively do anything about this, then I just simply don't know what could be done.
We have a number of questions that have come in. Professor Gross, go ahead.
So to me, and maybe it's because of my professorial, hat, it's always about education, education, education. Education is not only of the students, education is also of the professors, including those that self-define as experts. We have people coming from, again, not only Jewish studies, but all range of academic disciplines that have got nothing to do with the Middle East, that have no expertise in the Middle East, and profess all of a sudden an expertise. And so that should be the mask, in a sense, should be taken off. But I would say that in addition to the fact that we are failing Jewish students, by not protecting Jewish students, by leaving them to fend for themselves, whereas the pro-Palestinian students will always have faculty who are willing and able and ready to support them. Jewish students frequently have a challenge there. I would say that even for self-interest, professors of Jewish studies and Israel studies need to wake up. And the reason is that those professors cannot teach anymore in departments of Middle Eastern studies, unless you are following the sacred footsteps of Edward Said, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. There is nothing for you to look for in Middle Eastern studies as a PhD student, as a graduate student, or as a professor. And if they don't wake up, my fear is that will come to roost in Jewish studies, because the wokeism, right, will mean that those who are not willing to toe the line will not be able to teach in centers for Jewish studies. Now, again, for those of us who are affiliated, right, I am based in the law school. Membership in Jewish studies, as much as it's important to me, right, is not critical to my academic affiliation. And what's going to happen is, I think that also people such as myself will look for other alternative venues in which to express their opinions, including institutional venues, either within or outside academia.
Thank you. I want to thank the panelists for 3 really compelling presentations. I am fascinated, and I know I'm looking forward to having the recording so I can go back and hear them again, because I was furiously taking notes from each one of you. We have a number of very interesting questions. I'm not sure we will get to all of them, but several of them relate to the recent situation at UNC. And I want to read one of them that's kind of representative. As an academic, distinguished professor at a university where the Women's and Gender Studies Department has issued the sort of anti-Israel statement that Miriam mentioned, and where a course on the Israel-Palestine conflict is currently being offered by a graduate student who has declared that her mission is to persuade students that there's only one legitimate side to this conflict, I would welcome some concrete advice as to what I can do about this. And Professor Elman, I'd like to start with your response to this question, please.
Sure. I think it is important to think local, right? So that stakeholders, whether they are local community members, contributors to the university, UNC Chapel Hill is a public university. It will have different issues relevant there than, let's say, Duke, right? But one thing that's very important to understand is that it's up to university leadership, the administration, to support all students, to provide a welcoming, inclusive, tolerant learning environment free of harassment or discrimination. That's the obligation under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Administrations don't get a right to be silent on anti-Semitism that continues year after year after year unaddressed. Oren raised the issue of education. It's not only the students that need to be educated. Often the issue is peer-on-peer harassment and intimidation. This Kylie Broderick, PhD student teaching the course, she's a graduate student. She is meant to learn how to teach a correct class. She could be told to teach a different class. The problem is that that course was vetted by multiple senior faculty, which shows that there's a problem deep in that department. It's not the problem with her, it's her training, right? But the administration can always speak out for a faculty member or student, any speech that is hate speech. The administration also has free speech rights. They can use their own speech to condemn anti-Semitic hate speech. That's always an option. Silence, year after year, is not an option. Now at UNC, there actually is a settlement with the Office of Civil Rights. And so one thing the community can do, and the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill, working with other stakeholders like Hillel International and faculty members who are members of AAN, for example, is to make sure that they are compliant with the settlement. And part of that involves education of administrators. Administrators also need to be educated about the Jewish experience, Jewish identity, and anti-Semitism so that they can do a better job protecting and supporting students, as Oren said.
About that class, I'll just add one thing. My understanding, or at least when it was initially first put on the books, it's being cross-listed by 3 different departments, which means that 3 different departments allegedly vetted this and decided that it was a good idea to have a third-year graduate student who has very little teaching experience to teach what is a very difficult, and I teach this topic, it's a very difficult topic to teach because there are multiple sides to what's going on here. It's very complex. That means that 3 departments signed off, well aware of her, social media activism and her intent to bring this into the classroom to sway students to her point of view. And, one of the departments is the history department. I'm not at UNC, but I'm at UNCW, so we are, a related institution. But that means the history department signed off on it. And there are Jewish studies faculty in the history department. And I don't know what sort of internal conversations they might have had among themselves, but clearly they decided that, in the name of academic freedom, this is not something they're going to raise any concerns about publicly.
So couple of things, since we talked about academic freedom. First of all, I think that, in addition to everything that Miriam and Jared said, I think that there is an element that needs to be made clear to the university leadership, is that a course like this, regardless of now the substantive content, reflects really badly on UNC in the following sense. there are few topics, there are some, but few topics where there can only be one point of view. In any academic setting, to come and say there's only one point of view and you will learn only that one point of view reflects really poorly on the academic institution, right, that authorizes such a course. And I think that, again, writing, making the voices heard, right, is really, really important. I would say also one more thing, again, kind of tying to the stuff that we talked about, expertise. So in addition to history, frequently the flag bearers on many of those issues in university after university are departments such as gender, women, and sexuality studies. In the University of Minnesota, also race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality studies. As I said in a different context, there seems to be something with sex in the Middle East that gets people all kind of excited. But I leave that to kind of psychological elements. These are not experts, and they should not be held as experts to this issue of conflict. And finally, I would say, and I think that this is something that I don't know if how Miriam and Jared feel about this, but you know, I'm Israeli, I don't mind jumping in on this, is, you know, put also your dollars where your mouth is. Many of the universities have major Jewish donors. And while I would not agree with any donor stating or mandating what should be a content taught in any class, if I'm a donor, I definitely have a say in saying I do not want my precious dollars to be used anti a platform, anti a goal that I strongly believe in. And if you think, by the way, that this is totally Jewish, I would highlight the many universities, including Ivy League universities, that have centers funded by other Middle Eastern countries that should not be named, and those centers seem to be towing the line. So it's not unheard of.
Professor Gross, while you have the floor, there's interest in hearing a little bit more about your resignation from the Jewish Studies Department at your university.
Sure. So let me try and do it briefly so that we can have more questions come in. So the short of it, kind of in chronological order, was a letter that yours truly and another colleague from the French department sent to the provost at the University of Minnesota on May 24, so after the Guardian of the Walls conflict ends, and in which we expressed concern about a public statement that was made with extremely incendiary language of the sort that we frequently hear by several academic units, not professors, academic units at the University of Minnesota. And the only thing that we asked, we said, we will defend the right of professors to sign those statements. We think they're wrong, but we'll defend as a matter of free speech the right to sign on to those statements. But the provost ought to advise the said units that they should remove their collective signatures and replace them by individual signatures. Again, if you think about what pre-tenure does to scholars, imagine that you're a scholar in one of those departments and the department as a department is signing a certain statement. Obviously, if you, for example, disagree, you will not have what it takes to oppose it. So that's all we said, tell them that they cannot sign as departments. And by the way, that's a university policy. They can sign as individuals. We circulated the letter. 17 courageous souls, including the two of us, so 15 additional courageous souls signed the letter, 4 of which, including again the two of us, were members of the Center for Jewish Studies. On the same day, we got an email, or actually my colleague got an email from the director for the Center for Jewish Studies saying basically you need to know to pick your battles, which is usually what is said by those who never battle any battle, right? They're saying pick your battles. Okay, we waited 4 more days to see what additional courageous souls will sign on to that letter. And when 4 days passed and nothing happened, we sent another letter, an open letter to the Center for Jewish Studies faculty, in which we decried their deafening silence in the face of rising anti-Semitism and growing attacks on academic values. Again, not on anti-Israel, on anti-Semitic incidents. We also noted, by the way, that no less than 7 members of the Center for Jewish Studies actually signed that statement by scholars of Jewish and Israeli studies, including untenured faculty. So for the untenured faculty, signing such a statement did not seem at all something that they should be concerned about. It's actually maybe a badge of honor in the academic promotion system. Signing anything pro-Israel was not. We also stated that we strongly support the right of our colleagues to actually publish such a statement. But what we said is we decry the fact that they would not sign any statement, right, calling out anti-Semitism. Again, nothing to do with Israel, anti-Semitism. This is after LA, this is after New York, this is after, rape Jewish daughters in London, this is after attacks in Toronto, and still they wouldn't do. Their response to that open letter was an email by the director for the Center for Jewish Studies, the guy who said pick your battles, who sent an open email to all the members of the Center of Jewish Studies and said that our open letter, had the chilling effect of making our community of scholars seem like an unsafe place. This is the language that is always used to basically silence, unsafe place for the intellectual exchange of ideas about the subjects that concern us all. I won't belabor the point much more, but on that very same day, I resigned. I was hoping that others will join. They didn't. That's okay. That's their individual decision. And I basically said that I will be looking, and I am looking, to promote alternative, as I mentioned, alternative venues, either on campus or outside of campus, for real robust conversation about Israel and Jewish studies.
Thank you. Professor Elman, I'm going to ask you to address this. There's a question about whether or not legal is the only way to go. Letters have been written to chancellors, letters have been written to departments, letters have been written to the newspaper, and whether it's the UNC situation or anything else, is legal means the only recourse, and is that a possibility?
I should actually let the lawyer on the panel address it. But, I think that there is a role to play, certainly for the law and having recourse to a lawsuit. And there have been success stories. A lawsuit at San Francisco State resulted in a settlement that obligated the administration to do certain things and take certain steps. There was a lawsuit at NYU as well that moved forward, and oftentimes they're settled before they go to court. And those settlements, what do they lead to? They lead to the administration agreeing to do things that we wish they had implemented before the lawsuit, right? So anti-Semitism awareness training, mandatory programs for student leaders and government, mandatory statements that the university will do, and anti-bias a review of anti-bias procedures and so forth. So those are all the good things. We would like to see universities do that before the lawsuit, sometimes mentioning that I will turn to counsel, whether it's a faculty member or a student, can concentrate the mind of an administrator to actually do something on your behalf, so it doesn't have to even get that far. Students, faculty should always know what their rights are, and there are very good organizations, Stand With Us, Lawfare, the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law, that can help and assist. We've turned many faculty to them for legal assistance. But at the end of the day, as Jared and Oren and I think all mentioned, we're academics. We're interested in quality education, in rigorous education about Israel, about the Jewish experience, about Judaism, and about Zionism and Israel's history and contemporary politics. So the more we can bring in quality education and insist on that, that's the levers we want to pull. So better education at the student level, but also for mid-level administrators who are tasked with diversity, education, and inclusion. They also need this education.
And I'll add to what Miriam said. Yes, so there are legal tools, whether it's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII of of the Civil Rights Act. There are legal tools that can and have been used. The problem with those is that when they're successful, and there's no guarantee, but when they're successful, they're usually top-bottom. So they come at the level of the leadership of the university. They don't do much, and at times they might even antagonize, kind of going bottom-up. And so what we need here is some sort of a pincer movement. You need to use the law when the law ought and can be used. And there are times for that. But it cannot replace, right, education and grassroots movements that are designed to kind of try and attract the students, faculty, staff going bottom up. Just the law, just using the law would not be sufficient. Just using the bottom up might not be sufficient in some circumstances. In some circumstances, there's no other choice but to use the law. So you need to be able to use both of these as the need arises.
Thank you. We have so many good questions. I don't want to cut off the conversation. So we're going to go till 3:30. We apologize for being a little bit over, but I think we have some really great resources here that we don't want to stop the discussion. If anybody does need to leave, of course, we understand. Professor Tani, I'm going to ask you to address this question. What, if anything, explains the transition to anti-Zionist Israel Jewish studies? Is it that the academy as a whole is turning that way and Israel Jewish studies absorbs it? Or is there anything particular within the field that contributes to it?
Yeah, I think it's the direction that the academy as the whole has gone in. And I think that trend has been gradually developing going back several decades. You certainly see it already in some campuses and in some academic associations back, in the 90s and even earlier. I've spoken to some people actually at an AEN conference who are in women and gender studies, and they said that's where it began. They saw things starting to happen in the 70s and the 80s in women and gender studies, where they suddenly centered Palestine, and standing up for the Palestinians became their most important thing. There's certain individuals, all-star academics, such as people like Judith Butler, who clearly have played a role in pushing things in such disciplines in that direction. There have been people in Jewish studies also, going back 4 decades. And again, I did my PhD at Berkeley, so I'm well acquainted with these people who have tried to kind of push Jewish studies in that direction too. But, it's gradually been disseminating to more and more programs and departments. And we have younger cohorts of academics coming in. I will bring an age element into this, and I think you will note that with a lot of these petitions, especially in some disciplines, it's the younger people who are signing the anti-Israel petitions, not the older people. I'm going to use 40 as the cutoff age at the moment for being pro-Israel. I'm 49, so I'm still I'm very comfortably in the pro-Israel zone, I think. So, again, having gone to Berkeley in the late 90s, early 2000s, in the history departments, but more so in Jewish studies, I would say in Jewish studies, at that time, there was a strong anti-Israel bias in the interdisciplinary Jewish studies program at Berkeley. But Berkeley was notorious for this back then, right? And I think what was going on there has since then spread to far more universities. Does that answer the question?
Sure. Here's a question I'd like each one of the panelists to address. It seems that the most prestigious universities, or certainly many of the prestigious universities, have the biggest problems with anti-Zionism. Would you advise students who are accomplished enough to be admitted to these schools to avoid them?
Can I go first?
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I'm often asked that question. I mean, it's a larger, points to the larger question of to what extent is there a crisis for Jews in the American academy? And I do think we need to keep things in perspective, right? There are 4,000 or so universities and colleges in the United States, and most don't have these issues, right? Most actually don't have anti-Semitic incidents, and certainly don't have anti-Semitic forms of anti-Israel expression. I don't have problems at the faculty level or at the student level. And so it's important to put things in perspective. There used to be a time when there were quotas for Jewish students to come onto campus. Today, we have many campuses have Jewish chancellors and presidents. So being alarmist is not helpful, but it is also helpful to notice and understand what Jewish students are saying. Most Jewish students are going to enroll in the 200 to 300 campuses that do experience both anti-Semitism on the right and the left. And we know this from data. We have data from AMCHA, we have data from ADL, we have data from the Brandeis Center and AAPI now on how Jewish identified students in fraternities and sororities feel. We know very well that Jewish students will experience anti-Semitism at some point during their 4 years on those 200 to 300 campuses. But those are the top schools, and I would never say don't go to those schools, right? It's worth noting, though, we just published a paper in AAN that campuses that have an active Student for Justice in Palestine chapter, and those are about 300 campuses. They track really well with the campuses where Jewish students matriculate and enroll. And those campuses with an SJP, they experience 253% more anti-bias reporting by Jewish students than campuses without a Student for Justice in Palestine chapter. So we actually do have data, and when we present this to administrators, they begin to realize that there's a problem, okay? There are a lot of good resources on those 200 to 300 campuses, including Chabad on campus, including Hillel International. And so students should press, I think, also those organizations to take a stand and to demand more. And that is happening, actually, that is happening. Both Hillel and AAN have programs now to advise administrators to take a better stand. So I would never say to students, don't go to the top schools in the country. But those are being targeted by the national BDS movement. They know where the thought leaders of the next generation are going to be trained, and those are the schools that they pour in a lot of money. BDS is a very organized, well-oiled movement. And they're very, very strategic about where they put their money on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and then the Chicago hub. We have all the data for that.
Anything to add? Mm-hmm.
Well, my opinion is that I don't think if a child or a young adult has their heart set on going to a particular university and it's the best place to get the education that for what they want to do, I would think it would be absurd at this point to not go to that school because of a fear of anti-Semitism. I don't think we've gotten quite to that point yet. You know, if someone came up to me and said, yeah, I'd like to go to Berkeley, I'd say, and I got in, you know, funding great. I said, great. I said, I also want to, you know, become president of the Young Republicans Club and, you know, start a recruitment center for the IDF once I'm there. I would say, look, maybe you should think about a different school at that point. You know, it also, you know, it really depends on what they want to do there. I don't think most Jewish students need to walk around in fear on university campuses. I don't think we are really at that point, right? I do think they will hear things in classrooms that will make them uncomfortable depending on the courses that they take. And if they do, if they think that the line has been crossed, if they're being targeted, they should respond in the exact same way that any other minority in the United States would respond. If an African-American student feels that they are being vilified or subject to racism or some form of discrimination in the classroom or outside of the classroom and intends to take steps to do something about it, seeking out faculty or organizations or administrators that will help them, the Jewish students should do exactly the same thing. The Jewish students should not be afraid to do so because the bottom line, the Jews are a minority in this country subject to hate crimes, as Oren pointed out, just like anyone else.
So I have a perspective that is slightly different. I mean, not necessarily about the outcome, about where you should go, although even that I think I can contribute some anecdotal evidence on students actually choosing not to go to kind of the high-ranking schools. But I agree with Jared and Miriam in the sense that for the vast majority of Jewish students on campus, going to the Ivy Leagues or the other top schools, that should not be an issue. But we need to be nuanced here. The majority of Jewish students do not necessarily identify openly on campus as Jews. They don't wear kippah, they don't go with the Star of David, they don't necessarily wear their Jewishness on their sleeves. So for those, that's not the issue. But to me, that's also not the issue we're talking about here. For me, the interesting question is what happens to the students who are with the kippah, who are with the Magen David, who do want to be the presidents of, SSI or whatever student organization. And for these students, I would say that campus climate has become, in unfortunately too many campuses, toxic. And the problem is, and Miriam said this, we track a strong correlation between SJP and rise in anti-Semitism and toxicity towards Jewish students on campus. The problem is that frequently, while universities would pay close attention to the lived experiences of other minorities, the lived experiences of Jewish minority students, those that identify, that self-identify, that openly self-identify as Jews, is often ignored. And I would say that the other thing that to me is heartbreaking is that many of the schools, including my own alma mater, right, who had numerous clauses, who had quotas for Jews, right, in the past, are frequently the same schools that today, right, are the schools where Jewish students feel uncomfortable. And that is something that to me is severely, severely distressing.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question, and that is about the outside funding by countries such as Qatar. How significant is that in sponsoring anti-Zionist professorships in other departments on campus that are impacting the anti-Zionist atmosphere? Who'd like to address that?
So I'll jump in. I kind of alluded already to the fact that there's definitely in many universities, centers, programs, institutes that are heavily funded by countries where, if we're talking about wokeism, human rights, women's rights, LGBTQ's rights, minority rights, religious rights are not exactly well kept and preserved. And yet most universities, unfortunately, not all, by the way, there have been some glaring exceptions, but these are the exceptions that speak about the rule, are happy to take that money. Of course, everybody is saying taking that money does not mean that we will follow, that will toe necessarily a certain line. You have to say that because that's, again, academic freedom. But frequently it comes with those of you who are Monty Python aficionados with a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? We understand that, let's assume an Oren Gross need not apply for a chair in those departments or in those institutes or programs, right? Or Jared Tanner will not get anywhere in such academic units. So, it's to some extent, it's a game. It's a game we all understand. For some reason, right, when it's done by, take your pick, the Qataris, the Saudis, what have you, people have no problem with that. Any mention of Jewish donors doing anything they like, and everybody's starting, the Benjamins, the Jews control the media, the money, and what have you, and kind of the usual old anti-Semitic tropes come to the surface.
Any other comments from Professor Elman or Tanny?
The only thing I would add to that is I don't know the extent to which these countries are funding anti-Zionism in this country. But I suspect much of this is, domestically incubating. I think even if that money were to disappear, I suspect that the extent to which we have anti-Zionism on the university campuses would not change one bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There is a line of research to do there. And actually the Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism Globally and in Policy, ISCAP, does have some reporting on the following and tracking the money. On certain schools, it is an issue. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into certain specifically targeted schools, often in Middle Eastern studies or chairs of Middle Eastern, but that doesn't explain the women and gender studies or ethnic studies or some of the other disciplines where that isn't foreign money. I would just add that at UNC and Duke, there is a consortium for Middle Eastern studies, which is not funded it's funded by the US government. So it's also worth thinking about the 15 or so federally funded through Title VI, federally funded research centers for Middle Eastern studies. They all have a K through 12, by the way, a K through 12 outreach obligation. And in some areas of the country where we're seeing virulent anti-Israel and anti-Zionism moving down the educational train into K through 12, don't be surprised if it's some of those faculty at some of those Title VI federally funded Middle Eastern studies programs that are putting their faculty into the workshops that teachers are getting. We're starting to find some evidence of that. And so that's something that the community can do. The community, the taxpayers in the community can look and ask universities that are hosting and housing these Title VI federally funded programs. Show me, open up the books. I want to see what is the K through 12 outreach, right? I'm a taxpayer. I want to see whether there are faculty coming in and doing workshops to teachers in my community. So I think that is a piece of it's another piece. It's a different piece. I think following the money is important, but it's not the only factor that's impacting in what we've been discussing.
The important thing, and I think we all sort of got this across, but I want to just emphasize this, as we finish up here one last time, is that I think one of the purposes of, this is one of the reasons I know you organized this panel here is the wider Jewish community needs to be made aware of what's going on in academia today. And I think a lot of them don't realize it. Every time I just talk about it with my parents, they're just shocked. They just don't get it. They just can't believe the extent to which this is going on. So they need to be made aware that this is really a problem. And I'd say the wider Jewish community does need to be mobilized and try to help out as much as they can.
Thank you so much. That's exactly why we did the program today. We could probably have easily a week-long seminar on this topic. And I hate to bring it to a close, but it's an hour and a half. I think we're going to have to end the discussion. I want to thank each one of our panelists. I want to thank Mike Ross for moderating the panel. And we appreciate everyone. We hope to see all of you in person fairly soon at one of our programs once we're back, and we're not going to do everything virtually forever. Hopefully that day will be coming soon. Thank you so much, everyone.